Philosophy does very badly if it doesn't ground itself in poetic wisdom.
This is what I love about writers like Emerson is that they cannot help but be singing as they write.
I think there's something distinctive about Emerson's poetry between this desire for renewal and this nature.
Who can speak or write like this today, really? And how impoverished we are for it.
Oh, dear Diana, tell me why do the things that are beautiful always have a darker side? Oh, dear Diana, tell me why is the good never good enough? Underneath the dirt and scar is an old and familiar face.
All right, welcome back to another episode of Platonic Mysticism, the Ladder. We have been doing a series on Emerson with Professor Eli Kramer, and so this is a part 3. But I also think it follows quite naturally from the last two episodes with Professor Ian Hamilton Grant, whose philosophies of nature stem from Schelling. And there's a kind of, zeitgeist happening in the 19th century that, this turn towards nature is reflected also in Emerson. And so we decided today that we would concentrate on the 2 essays on nature. The first one, of course, is very popular, most know it, but as Professor Eli Kramer always reminds us, the shorter follow-up piece has some substantial weight to it. And so, we're going to utilize it as well today in our discussion.
Yeah, and they're both remarkable pieces of writing which return us to many of the Emersonian themes that we've discussed previously, but which also really interconnect with so many of the other themes we've covered, both in our conversation with Ian, on Milton, on that whole tradition really of kind of visionary poetry and of seeing the divine in nature and all of these things. I think if we look at the period in which these essays were written, firstly, it's an interesting period in terms of Emerson's first Nature was, I believe, his first publication, and this was in 1836. And then the later edition or the later Nature essay was 1844. So we have a period of 8 years that elapses between those dates. And just looking biographically at that period of his life, a few years before, he published the first Nature, which is in 1836. So in 1833, he travelled to Europe, to Rome, to Paris, and in London, he met, amongst others, Samuel Taylor Coleridge and William Wordsworth, notable English nature poets. So this is interesting, and there's also a tragedy in his life as well, in between the publications of these versions of nature in that 8-year period. His young son dies from scarlet fever, and I think perhaps maybe this forms some backdrop biographically to how we could look at some of the themes that evolve across those versions, but also seen within the broader oeuvre of his philosophy and his interests. But they are both remarkable texts in different ways. And I think perhaps we could start with the first. I think in my edition, they are probably 2 of the most annotated essays, with the most marginalia and notes, because in many ways they encapsulate a lot of his thought, I think, and they seem to capture also very essential ideas about nature, the human spirit, participation, beauty, all of these things.
Yeah, I'm just curious of, this is one especially in American philosophy, poor Emerson, that gets read and again and again. So, just for you both, especially coming out of Ian Hamilton Grant and others who have been, work on Schelling and also have sort of some of the roots of this conception of nature. What struck you all?
For me, the beauty, right? So I can't remember exactly where the line is, if it's in the first or the second, but this idea that the philosopher seeks truth, but the poet seeks beauty, and it's kind of a romantic relationship. It feels like sometimes, as you read through both essays, that there is this sense of the feminine beauty that he is drawn to. Yeah. And, even in the first essay where it's like, don't treat her like something to expose, right? And for me, that's my first reaction is just that relationship to nature and beauty and its complexity and its motion, and ceaseless motion that somehow still paradoxically provides for rest. And so.
Yeah, I think in idealism, which is I forget which number that is because the first nature essay is it's chapter VI, so that's and it's into that after he does I think the Shakespeare quote. It's like number 3 in these bullets. While the poet animates nature with his own thoughts, he differs from the philosopher only therein that the one proposes beauty as his main end, the other truth. But the philosopher, not less than the poet, postpones the apparent order and relation of things to the empire of thought. The problem of philosophy, according to Plato, is for that all exists conditionally, to find a ground unconditioned and absolute. It proceeds on the faith that a law determines all phenomenon, which being known, the phenomena can be predicted. The law, when in the mind, is an idea, its beauty is infinite. The true philosopher and the true poet are one, and a beauty which is truth, and a truth which is beauty, is the aim of both. I think also I suspect there's lots, this piece, feels very Platonic to me in the sort of Timaeus style too, of there's a lot of self-reflection about the narrator telling a story about nature and not I, and trying to explicate it. So I feel a lot of him sort of playfully as author, both interceding and even sort of structuring in these sort of sublated levels of our engagement of nature, his own creative demiurgic project, which I tend to be very drawn to pieces like this because I think they're much more attentive to the act of poetizing and philosophizing as you're doing it, and a lot comes out of having that be much more carefully attended to.
Yeah, and what I love is he draws the idea that ethics is not just applied philosophy, but it's a concept, an idea made into your life that becomes virtue, right? And so that when we think about the discipline of ethics, right, like this just that throwaway line where ethics is that's lived nature, like you're actually performing the virtues, the telos, or the ends for which beauty emerges in the human being. And so, yeah, I just thought that was a nice. Oh, here, I can just read this line too. It's in the second part of beauty. The presence of a higher, namely of the spiritual element, is essential to its perfection. The high and divine beauty, which can be loved without effeminacy, is that which is found in combination with the human will. Beauty is the mark God sets upon virtue.
You can definitely see I was struck too there. We've talked about this sort of logic of similitude, Puritan to Petrus Raymond world of infinite analogy, but you can also certainly see the sort of Kant Schelling line about beauty being a symbol for morality, but in this sort of deeper sense you're talking about what he has this famous quote about. Let me read the sort of playful syllogism about natural facts. Where is that? This is in the beginning chapter of language. Words are signs of natural facts. Particular natural facts are symbols of particular spiritual facts. Nature is a symbol of spirit. In this case, words are these, and this is sort of what he gets from Ramus and will get picked up by people of Peirce, that instead of like a certain thread of Kantian thought that's more first critique, people through Coleridge who are interested in the third critique end up moving much towards a position that signs uh, have a real relationship to the world. They're not merely human and mediatory. And they show, I mean, this also gets connected to the Platonic tradition, wants to keep this sort of Platonic holism alive. And so what gets carried from words is sort of indexing these aspects of the world which reveal the deeper truth. And for him, beauty reveals the sort of deeper active nature ethics you were talking about, Danny, which is sort of different. And I mean, I like it because it's just so much more present in the world, I think is powerful about it instead of feeling very encapsulated in yourself.
I think what strikes me is the very beginning of nature, the first version, because as you say here, when we think about this vision of the lone poet or the lone philosopher walking in nature, sometimes that's characterized as a sort of heroic endeavor of sorts, which is not an idea I'm necessarily opposed to, but I think that actually when you read this carefully, you get a sense that this is about being open to a gift that is accessible to all. So there's this really beautiful sense that he describes the idea of solitude and reverence. If a man would be alone, let him look at the stars. And then a little further down, the stars awaken a certain reverence, because although always present, they are inaccessible. But all natural objects make a kindred impression when the mind is open to their influence. Nature never wears a mean appearance, neither does the wisest man extort her secret and lose his curiosity by finding out all her perfection. So in this moment of kind of solitude and openness to a reverence, we see this inexhaustible gift, the possibility that we can know nature without instrumentalizing her. We can thereby know ourselves and by extension perhaps extend an ethics into the world which comes from the I into the thou and the you, because nature in a sense is a sort of world soul of being. And so this is the sort of the beginnings of reciprocity, the beginnings of connection and participation. And it's interesting that he'll use, I mean, he met Coleridge, as I said, a few years before he published this. And in his study, in his house, the old manse in Concord, Massachusetts, in Emerson's study, he has on his window ledge an Aeolian harp, a wind harp, and a picture of Coleridge as well on the wall. And I think we've talked and quoted Coleridge, and what if all of animated nature be but an Aeolian harp, so this idea of man as an instrument of participation. And in fact, Emerson will use those very images. I'll have to find the quotes. But I think it's the later version of.
He says, "This is my Orphic song," right?
Yeah, a boy hears the echoes of a horn in a hill country in the mountains, which converts the mountains into an Aeolian harp. So nature becomes an instrument. He says it elsewhere. He says the musical streaming. The mimic waves of acres of Estonia, whose innumerable florets whiten and ripple before the eye, the reflections of trees and flowers in glassy lakes, the musical steaming, odorous south wind, which converts all trees to wind harps. So, there's this kind of Coleridgean image there that, we too can be an instrument upon which nature plays and attune ourselves, as it were, to her rhythms and all of these kind of things. So it's interesting where this comes out of that, romantic philosophy. But as an Englishman, what's always interested me, obviously, in one sense, being an inheritor to that Wordsworthian Coleridgean tradition, which we'll read in school and all that kind of stuff, is and I think I mentioned this before. This, I don't know, for me particularly and sometimes peculiarly idiomatic Americanism of Emerson's writings, which I find really beautiful actually, but there's something distinctly, I find anyway, American about them. Uh, and perhaps there's something you might both be able to say about that more than I could, but they strike me as having this particular character, which I don't find, I can find parallels to, but not anything quite the same in uh, figures like a Coleridge or a Wordsworth.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly one, of the common tropes is where this bit that the first nature essay begins, where he sort of sets out the problem. Is I think there's a few different themes, but this is one of the grounding ones, which is about sort of American desire for renewal, reconstruction, this sort of image of themselves in a new world, both one very old but also very new at the same time. And so, like, the introduction begins. Our age is retrospective. It builds the sepulchres of the fathers. It writes biographies, histories, and criticisms, which an American scholar poetically, but often an American imagination geographically, and well before Emerson, these are all things that are associated with Europe. And then he sort of goes on to the question of uh, whether we can have our own original relationship with nature that's sort of this different from the world that we came from and the way the sort of past impedes on the present. And even sort of his trips to Europe, like many Americans who go to particularly Italy, there's this sense of, especially if as you all know, like if you went to Rome at the time, it was, pretty delinquent and sort of messy in the sense of like a lot of ancient history, but not very well preserved. So sort of ruins and beneath, but not enlivened now. So I think like one thing that comes up in his prose is this, need for renewal and energy. I think that the question about wilderness, it would be interesting to think. I would have to, go back to Coleridge more and Wordsworth because there is grand nature, but I do think there's something even stronger in people like Thoreau. Is this wildness and open expansiveness to nature. One anecdote I'll just leave with on that element is one of my close colleagues from the University of Warsaw said like one of the first times he felt like he was able to understand American consciousness is when he finally did a road trip from the East Coast to California. And he just said, for him growing up in Poland, the sort of sheer expansiveness of sort of empty natural space was different and sort of it made him think about what that does to the psyche, especially when those spaces were even less encroached upon, about sort of what it does to your imagination to have that openness. And there's a lot of literature in like, how especially early Puritans and some of the sort of early communities, especially towards the Louisiana Purchase, that also gets very toxic into the forms of manifest density and conquering this unknown. But anyways, it sort of runs very deep, I think, in American consciousness. And I think there's something distinctive about Emerson's poetry between this desire for renewal and this nature. And then weirdly coupled with the tragedies of his own life, because the first nature essay is not so far after his wife died. And we discussed the story of him on I think a year after she died, feeling like he needed to dig up her coffin to really see that she was dead, because like there was some part of him that couldn't process it, and then he was able to move on till he did it. So there's something about this was sort of Robert D. Richardson's biography is about this, something in him that's really eager for this renewal too, because so much of his life was tragedy and feeling limited and trying to find this renewal in the world that he was struggling to find.
So this quote from the Second Nature essay might complement what you just said. Nature is always consistent, though she feigns to contravene her own laws. She keeps her laws and seems to transcend them. She arms and equips an animal to find its place in living in the earth, and at the same time, I messed it up. All right, hold on, let me back one sentence. Same time, she arms and equips another animal to destroy it. Space exists to divide creatures, but by clothing the sides of a bird with a few feathers, she gives him a petty omnipresence, right? Like, so this kind of paradoxical nature of nature's, like, he wants it to bend her, she wants to bend her laws, right? She seems to do the impossible, but at the same time she still has an identity. And so I can see this kind of like why he would wrestle with the possibility, like that his wife isn't dead, right? Because there seems to be something miraculous about nature, but also something so mundane as well, right? So, strict to, be keeping the time, so to speak. And so, yeah, I think that's what he's trying to get at in the second one. This kind of, like, I think he's playing with the
Yeah.
paradox of nature and its beauty and its connection and how it's omni within us, right? It's the I. But I think in the second one, he's really wrestling with that Platonic paradox of the both and, right? Because this is for me what he just keeps going through in that second essay, and so.
Yeah, I don't want to psychoanalyze Emerson, as it were, but I think this, what I was alluding to in the notion of heroism was this strand of his thought around self-reliance, I suppose, and also about having to, in some sense, conquer oneself and overcome, as it were. So nature has this kind of nourishing power, which, yeah, brings us back into the realm of myth and our own inner struggles and these kinds of things. Um, he said something very beautiful and tragic about his wife's passing. Uh, My angel is gone to heaven this morning, and I am alone in the world and strangely happy. God be merciful to me, a sinner, and repair this miserable debility in which her death has left my soul. And then this is 1831, so this is a few years then before the publication of the first essay and so on. So there's this kind of interesting idea here around beauty and consolation, and also the kind of question of philosophy and wisdom as having this consolatory function, as in Boethius and these kinds of ideas. How do we come to terms with our own tragedy or our own fallenness or our own distance from God or whatever it might be? And in Emerson's philosophy, nature is the sort of powerful theatre in which we sort of come to terms and grapple, as you say, Danny, with this kind of Platonic and and both type thing, in some way.
Let's pray Danny doesn't mess up reading again, because this goes to what you're saying as far as nature is healing. It's again in the second essay. These enchantments are medicinal. They sober and heal us. These are plain pleasures, kindly and native to us. We come to our own and make friends with matter, with the ambitious chatter of the schools would persuade us to, which the ambitious chatter of the schools would persuade us to despise. We never can part with it. The mind loves its old home. As water to our thirst, so is the rock, the ground, to our eyes and hands and feet. It is firm water. It is cold flame. What health, what affinity. Ever an old friend, ever like a dear friend and brother, when we chat effectively with strangers, comes in this honest face and takes a grave liberty with us and shames us out of our nonsense. Shames us out of our nonsense. I just
Yeah,
love that, like.
there's definitely another passage which I underlined and thought, I know Danny's going to say something about this one that I thought when I was reading it again today, the sort of thing because it takes us into Plato and the sort of pharmakon and the nature of philosophy as a kind of form of, well, what, therapeutic or cathartic or other form of activity. I don't know. There's something in this, isn't there? It's consolatory in some way, as I said. Um, and that line a little, yeah. I was just going to say, and there's that line a little way down from that passage where he says, uh, the blue zenith is the point in which romance and reality meet. I think if we should be wrapped away into all that we dream of heaven and converse with Gabriel and Uriel, the upper sky would be all that would remain of our furniture. So this kind of, I mean, this is the rim of the Empyrean, isn't it? It's that sort of Platonic image of ascent in the Phaedrus as well. This kind of calling to a higher reality, but that is visible as a kind of theophany, as it were, within the natural world.
And I think your reference to the pharmacon hits something that's very deep for Emerson, which is it's like it is tragic comic for him, and the sections are pretty funny on as it goes sort of later as you move from the first section being sort of moving through nature in its sort of stillness whole as natura naturata to natura naturans in this sort of active form. You also both feel identity and delimitation. And why this is poured into your sort of mentioning self-reliance, which for him is a project of sort of feeling self-empowerment, but in particular is one's own expression of the universe. But a problem always sort of circulating for him is his desire to acknowledge both his ability to do that and like there's something tragic about the very ability to express something that makes one exaggerative. I mean, it's also just sort of comical. And I feel like I think a lot of the subtlety of his writing is wanting to both empower you and empower himself to that freedom, but also then recognize that by that very process, you're an overstatement and one that will become institutionalized and delimiting because it is an exaggeration. And this is, his part. This is this is part of the sort of natura naturan section. He gets into this paragraph of identity express organized around rest. The counteraction runs also into organization. But then this interestingly leads to this idea that exaggeration is in the course of things. It's sort of in the middle of the paragraph. Nature sends no creature, no man into the world without adding a small excess of his proper quality. Given the planet, it is still necessary to add that impulse, like that this part of this energetic movement is to not be at rest, to not have this perfectly divine, settled whole that's complete. And so that's why you need this impulse into it, so that every creature added a little violence of direction in its proper path, a shove to put it on its way, in every instance, a slight generosity, a drop too much. Without the electricity, the air would rot, and without this violence of direction, which men and women have, without a spice of bigot and fanatic, no excitement, no efficiency. And he has that fine, funny line later that I also really quoted. That's a really good Emer one. But nature has answered her purpose with curly, dimpled lunatic. And he talks about the sort of own madness of writing and, being, so you write your poetry journal, you write your personal journal that feels really deep and powerful to you, and you share it with a friend, and they're sort of awkwardly trying to appreciate your intelligence, but, it does not speak some deeper truth. And talked about he even talks about the sort of arrogance we have about our own work, but I don't think he thinks it's necessarily bad. It's just sort of inevitable to being human. That's why he has this last one I'll read of this. No man is quite sane. Each has a vein of folly in his composition. I think he's speaking to himself here. A slight determination of blood to the head to make sure of holding him hard to some point which nature has taken to heart. Like I don't think he thinks you can escape this. It's just sort of the nature of naturing here, that you go a little mad by this excess impulse if you want to bring forth birth ideas into the world.
Yeah, and of course we can speak of nature's beauty, and one is invariably drawn to these very powerful and beautiful images. But of course, even just thinking about what we said about the biographical context of this, I mean, nature will also destroy you. It may be romantic to take a walk in the woods on a warm summer's afternoon, but if you did it in the depth of night in the midwinter, you might not last very long. So there's this kind of sense in which nature itself is at once invites us, but is also kind of indifferent to us as well. and you think about the death of his son from disease, the death of his wife. There's this sense that you're grappling, and just to put it in the historical context as well of when, I mean, he was one of, I think I even read of 8 children, he was one of only 5 to survive childhood from his parents and so on. So we're talking about a period where tuberculosis and other diseases of this kind would ravage families, and the mortality rate among children and so on was incredibly high. So there's a danger, isn't there, in kind of being led into some where, if you like, the image becomes a kind of delusion or something like this. We have to not let ourselves get too comfortable with the idea. In a way, we can sort of hold on to a certain kind of longing or image, but we can go too far as well.
Like, yeah, I think he like wants some. This is always. I feel like the Emerson move is like, how do you hold it all at once? He wants, a greater synthesis, the pluralism, the deep pluralism that can't be completely held together, the many, but also the sort of unity of function that, moves this sort of distol and style. So you have the tragic hubris, you have just the funny inevitability of it, you have nature placating us. I think he's better in the second series of sort of hinting at nature not quite being so accommodating to us. There's a little more resistance even in this essay of, our desire to articulate it and be more expansive. It sort of is in the first nature essay, but I think one of the challenges, the limitations structurally to the first nature essay is it's built so strategically as a sort of a ladder of ascension. It almost had it's an immediate. It does have an immediate structure. That you move beyond the sort of hypostases level of nature to sort of see the task of what it means to have our own unique relationship to it. So you sort of move from the questions about nature to a sort of instrumental relationship to nature, to beauty in itself, to like what language we could do in the act of language. This is also where I'm sort of I think there's a lot of echoes of the Timaeus, that he sort of asked the question of what you're even doing in writing a work like this about your relationship to nature.
No, the section on language is thoroughly Neoplatonic. I mean, it's like it's even getting at the idea that everything contains these, divine signatures, so to speak, and so that our words, right, the language that we use is actually this great connective tissue, right? That I've seen in, let's say, let's get to the direct. An enraged man is a lion, a cunning man is a fox, a firm man is a rock, a learned man is a torch, a lamb is innocence, a snake is subtle spite. Flowers express to us the delicate affections. Light and darkness are our familiar expressions for knowledge and ignorance, and heat for love. Visible distance behind and before us is respectively our image of memory and hope, right? Like seeing like the distance, just looking off into, like, to go back to this idea of the American like landscape and seeing the abyss, right? The distance, like in the landscape, right? It's there, this nature communicating, not with the words, but the words actually show that we are tied to the sensible, and that, like Plato wants in the Timaeus, this is good, this is beautiful, that we can see these signatures of the divine, as the Neoplatonists would call it.
And he even makes it's interesting, he goes from language to discipline, because I think part of it is like you get the sort of engagement we have aesthetically with nature. You get the means to our doing it. That language really gives us this, the real signatures of the structure. And then he gives a section of what we can do with the faculties we have to sort of organize it. And that, there's a lot of people sort of mess around with the structure, because obviously there's really a sort of uh, deep speculative metaphysics going on into sort of a very thought out structure here. But like one of the interesting moves that people a lot of think about is like from discipline, the order of ascent then goes to idealism, and only then to spirit as a sort of final movement of sort of returning back to ourselves, and then prospects, what we can do with it. So it is a very uh, original, to use his own one, of like a ladder of ascension. You know, you can obviously find it in Ficino, and I definitely think, you know, the Aeneids and Plotinus and the sort of structure of ascent and sort of guiding people through it is. But he has an interesting one of like uh, what the up-down movement is, you know, very distinctive there, with a little bit of, you know, Hegel, with still pre-Hegel, but certainly through Schelling, and eventually later Hegel very much fit for Emerson, with once he reads him of sort of what he's thinking about here, you know, spirit as this high point between the sort of diversified human and nature as this other expansiveness sort of get integrated as this sort of continuous project.
Yeah, and I think Hegel died in what 1831, something like that.
It's been too long since I read. I think it's like I could be totally off base. Like the late 1830s, he ends up reading him, as there's like one edition in, and as a sort of some of the Hegelian movement in the U.S. moves on. But there's like some where it's just like people like Nietzsche, Schelling, and Coleridge directly. He did read some of the we do know, I think, the third critique of Kant and Schiller. Like he's just people get excited, and he's a good reader and conversation with them because he just sees these sort of common elements that a lot of people are playing with at the time. But yeah, I forget exactly where he read them. I think, again, to quote me before, he hadn't read it by the time of the first Nature essay, but I think by the time of the second, he had already read some sort of diluted sections of the phenomenology of spirit. I think, even if I remember, there was a sort of abridged version that was floating around.
Yeah, I wanted to circle back to this kind of question of ethics and the good and these kinds of ideas as well. And I'm gonna go slightly off piste here and jump to a different essay altogether, which is his famous divinity address that he gave in Cambridge, a Harvard Divinity School in 1838. And I was very lucky to go to the chapel at Harvard Divinity School and stand on the lectern where he gave this talk. And there was actually a copy of the talk that permanently lives on that lectern, which was quite nice. It's the one where he begins, "In this refulgent summer, it's been a luxury to draw the breath of life," and so on and so forth. But he says, all things proceed out of the same spirit, and all things conspire with it. Whilst a man seeks good ends, he is strong by the whole strength of nature. In so far as he roves from these ends, he bereaves himself of power, of auxiliaries. His being shrinks out of all remote channels. He becomes less and less, a mote, a point, until absolute badness is absolute death. So there's this kind of very powerful image there of this sort of retreat. And this is very Platonic as well, isn't it? This idea of the kind of the fallen, you know, the evil or the lack of the good, as it were, being this alienation or distance from things. But here he talks about this sort of conspiring relation to spirit and nature, which we withdraw from, or something of this kind. And I just mentioned that because that was clearly written in the period in between the two editions of the nature essays. And incidentally, I think he was then not invited back to Harvard for another 30 years after he gave that talk.
I mean, because he essentially says, and he's pretty explicit, that you go into your boring church service again, and like, you know, where's that divine inspiration? And you look out the window, and there you see the signatures of something significant, you know, signs of spiritual facts. So what am I doing in here? And, you know, he also gave up his preacher role and, you know, all of his seminary work. So people did not I think appreciate that. I mean, and even for that transitionary period, really building with the transcendentalists who are pretty radical, even by this exploratory Protestantism in the U.S. with, Channing and the Unitarians of that sort, which are, in pretty much every area on the sort of everything from politics to their views of individual autonomy to equality of genders and races to, even polyamory. I sort of mentioned, you were talking about Margaret Fuller, and she was deeply influential on him, but they also talked about having a sort of deep erotic relationship, and one of sort of what is that? Richardson's hypothesis is, from the records we have, that she wanted to explore the sexual part of that relationship, and he decided he just wanted the eros of ideas, a little too prudish. He was flirting with it, but backed off at the end. So, like it, his. I think to sort of bring it to what you were saying, there's something really interesting in Emerson about that sort of renewal, the resistance of the decay and isolation, and then yet the sort of tragedies and limitations of his own life, as he's sort of always playing with this boundary space of like sort of fully going into the bold, and then just the limitations of the world himself, and I think his own awareness as he expresses in this piece, of even the act of writing of your own unique angle of vision is just uh, it's not delimited in the way people most would think of, like, only like your truth is partial in the sense that it's just a tiny fragment. It's like you actually do express the whole. It's just to express the whole, you're always in exaggeration, and all insight over time. Forget if it's like, I think the essay Fashion or Character, he says it just gets institutionalized. Whatever truth you have, we build these cultural edifices on it, and it becomes passé over time. The way I always think about it, which is so true, like Emerson's pretty explicit on this, is there's a reason thought has all these movements, and then they become problematic over time. And for Emerson, it doesn't really matter if it's logical positivism or post-structuralism. Someone had some really cool, unique individual insights. They coalesce as a movement, but there was exaggeration in there because there has to be to sort of express the universal perspective you're giving, and then you're going to write a lot of derivative technical crap that sort of superficially extends or exhausts those ideas from what they had to contribute in the first place. So I guess the last thing I'd say, I think some people miss about Emerson that I like, is just because he thinks everyone has a unique aspect of genius does not mean he thinks everything is great work. He's, actually quite clear that there's a lot of building, superficial derivative things, and it is very hard to express what you can express that's original without going into this sort of tragic habit of humans to make things that institutionalize and kill instead of provide living spirit to the world.
No, but that's what you were trying to get at with the idea, like this builds in the first essay, right? Like this is a practice, right? That we get to, there is a discipline to it, right? Like, so, yeah, so there, in some sense, to have beauty and language prior to discipline, right, is that these things inspire us to realize that our relationship with nature is much like a marriage, right? That you can fall in love, you can see the beauty, you can speak all the sexy words to her, and have a natural ability to do this, but that's not going to cut it, right? Like that's not going to make it, actually unfold the spirit, right? Actually get you to this place of being inspired. I mean, I forget exactly where it is, but he basically says, you're writing the infinite, right? And, the absolute. And if your pen doesn't have that in it, right, then your words will be naught, right? And it doesn't, and if your pen is writing the absolute, the infinite, then it doesn't matter if anybody's reading it as well, right? So this kind of beautiful paradox that the uninspired won't be read, but if you're inspired, it doesn't matter if you're read, because what you're doing is you're mirroring this great love that you've learned is is something beautiful, something you can talk to and seduce, and with the wonderful, beautiful words. But at the end of the day, you still have to, develop this discipline so you can get to that Platonic idealism, and see that there's more than saturating every word, every horizon, every attempt to unfold what we, as Goethe called it, that fragile empiricism, right? That I'm seeing more than in everything before me, and so.
Yeah, I mean, Goethe is another here, which is so clear of this, like, yeah, this everything that's already present. That he repeats in both essays about like it's not like there are fun. It's this vision of unclothing nature. It's very against Emerson. He's much more on the Goethe side that there are veils, but it's sort of just a present in the plenitude that nature provides. So there's always the limitation, and there's the sort of obviously the Neoplatonism too, but in a positive way that is also madness, that is also your unique angle that will give you the rich resources. But I was also thinking to Gareth something you've talked about in our discussions about the speculative, that I think Emerson is definitely on the side of like, you get in touch with this stuff, it will lead to creative work, but it's not like the focus should not be on the creative work as an end itself and like all these sort of Schopenhauer anxieties of, anxiety of influence stuff sort of misses the point, or, the reasons Danny just pointed to, that like the best we can hope for is this original relationship to the world and to have a little Delphic oracle, Apollo move through us. But like if we want more than that, that's just when we get into hubris, like the friend who wants the other friend to, read the piece of writing and appreciate your insight. And they're just, that's where our hubris about our own profit powers just gets a little arrogant for, I think Emerson's taste. Yeah, again, I think it's like putting in touch with instead of this obsession about whether our work is worthy or not is, he has an interesting play on that. Like, I think he's not on the, like, you shouldn't care about your work at all, because he also expresses like the anxiety of a writer doing meaningful work, but sort of wants us to hold this in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, I think this links back to some of the things I was attempting to articulate earlier about this double-edged relation to nature and and where we find or how we use that inspiration. And there's a very profound passage towards the end, or at the very end of the nature section of the first series of nature essays. And he's talking about, the delight that nature offers us in this kind of redemptive sense that we've been talking about. But he says, yet it is certain that the power to produce this delight does not reside in nature, but in man, or in a harmony of both. It is necessary to use these pleasures with great temperance. For nature is not always tricked in holiday attire, but the same scene which yesterday breathed perfume and glittered as for the frolic of the nymphs is overspread with melancholy today. Nature always wears the colours of the spirit. To a man labouring under calamity, the heat of his own fire hath sadness in it. Then there is a kind of contempt of the landscape felt by him who has just lost by death a dear friend. So, there's this kind of sense that nature's also a kind of a mirror, isn't it? And this is interesting insofar as it's partly to do with that inner-outer relation of what nature is and what we construct it to be as well. So we can be mistaken or we can be misled by our own emotion or our own shortcomings or our own calamities even, in what that mirror shows us of ourselves.
Yeah, again, this is one of the ones I think, that I think where another way why Emerson is such a powerful carrier of the Platonic tradition is this is the reason he thinks essay writing or these broad, expansive experiential pieces that have systematic order but sort of guide you through sort of different paradigmatic engagements are much more effective for his purposes. Because otherwise, you get the right kind of writing that thinks it can exhaust nature, especially something that's expansive as including the I and not I, in sort of one gestalten moment. And that sort of reduces instead of opens you up. And nature always wants like these sort of attendant relations to become exposed, connected, more nested and meaningful. And like writing that it's not just that it provides you experience, but it's actually attentive of the narration of this kind of writing. It produces a much more complex effect of engaging with those issues. That I think he thinks it's just infinitely more generative than sort of, I mean, a more sort of narrow argumentative piece. And I think that's another where, Coleridge is so thoughtful, and I know he learned a lot from, is, someone who, and well, same for Carlyle, that as well, people who played with style and the sort of sensitivity to the writing of the poetic and philosophical experience, and we're able to recover that as well. And I mean, coming back to these essays, that's one of the things that comes back strongest. It's like, how do you provide people experiences? I mean, and just think about what he was doing with his career, which he found most meaningful, which is being a speaker that provides people these gestalts and these entryways and these different tonalities that both provide people a profound experience, but don't foreclose them in it. Don't let them settle too confidently, and instead hold it in complex synthesis.
Style's an interesting point. And it just made me think who can speak or write like this today, really, and how impoverished we are for it, in a sense. This, lack of holding together in style the complexities of these kinds of ideas.
No, but this is why I think we keep reading out loud these words, is because we recognize the melody behind it. We were reading, right, and we see words, but like at the end of the day, we feel the spirit, the cadence, this movement, right, and the importance of that, right, as part of his voice, as part of his vision. I mean, it's the same thing that happens when you read Plato too, right? You see that each character has a particular character because it's been written in such a way as to draw out the kind of song Thrasymachus is singing, or Socrates is trying to tweak, and so on and so forth. This is what I love about writers like Emerson, is that they cannot help but be singing as they write. I mean that in a kind of allegorical way, or metaphorical way, but it still feels true. Like here, I want to read and please forgive me if I've already read it or if you've already read it. The last part of the last paragraph in the very end of the first Nature, because it reminds us that what we're doing when we think and engage with nature, and we've given ourselves the discipline, we can see the divine signatures, we have a hope for the future of what we can create and build, and so he's ending, right, with this kind of remember your place in the all, right, kind of moment. So shall we come to look at the world with new eyes? It shall answer the endless inquiry of the intellect, what is truth, and of affections, what is good, by yielding itself passive to the educated will. Then shall come to pass what my poet said: nature is not fixed, but fluid. Spirit alters, molds, makes it. The immobility of bruteness of nature is the absence of spirit. Pure spirit is fluid, it is volatile, it is obedient. Every spirit builds itself a house, and beyond its house a world, and beyond its world a heaven. Know then that the world exists for you. For you is the phenomenon perfect. What are we that only can we see? All that Adam had, all that Caesar could, you can do. Adam called his house heaven and earth. Caesar called his house Rome. You perhaps call yours a cobbler's trade, 100 acres of plowed land, or a scholar's garret.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And just the next couple of lines as well. Mm-hmm. Yet line for line and point for point, your dominion is as great as theirs, though without fine names. Build therefore your own world. Yeah.
I
Yeah,
stopped too soon.
fantastic. So
But
keep
that's
going.
it. Because sometimes we get so trapped in our aloneness, and I'm sure that Emerson did, right? Like, because he found it as a good. But when you get trapped in your aloneness, then you start to doubt your relationship with nature. You start to doubt your capabilities. And what I love about this closing is this kind of remember that even in your aloneness, right? This too is beautiful. This too is good. This too is a invitation to remember that you are just as Caesar was, just as all the scholars, or not scholars, all the great minds that he's been writing about when he gets to those great thinkers. That there's a connection, regardless of what despairing moment you're experiencing. And so, yeah.
Yeah, this is, one of maybe this will be one of my endpoints of like, one of the things that got me first excited about my own work in philosophy as a way of life was just covering the broader genres of philosophizing that are so important for both that therapia, but also touching it in a complex tonality that's, I think, very difficult in an academic essay to do. And, increasingly on my curmudgeonly humanist side, I really do buy a sort of two connected Giambattista Vico points, which I've talked about, which is the barbarity of reflection, which is, he said, there's a reason why these pieces get killed, which is that whenever you're in sort of reflective analysis mode, that particularly institutions of higher education think their only job is to produce pieces that are little pieces of thought that contribute to the sort of Lego blocks of scientific knowledge. Other kinds of engagement get subsumed to that because like this sort of third person analyst becomes everything and sort of subsumed all of our other activities. And I was just reading this book by Andrew W. Reck on speculative philosophy, and he was quoting all these studies from the 40s where people were, and I know this because of the history of professionalization of philosophy, where people were already saying, I fully expect that, most philosophy writing will be essays, essay articles for journals, by the end of by the early 50s. And, he was like citing several people who were just like looking at a display of departments and what they were doing. And I do think this connects to the second part of Vico, which is very rooted in the Platonic tradition, that philosophy does very badly if it doesn't ground itself in poetic wisdom, because it'll pick its topics arbitrarily instead of something rooted in something a fundamental to our experience, which is what the arts and poetry try to aim us towards, and you'll just get this sort of arbitrary navel gazing. It'll
Yeah.
reduce the navel gazing in its
When you
wording.
said rooted in, and I couldn't help but want to finish your sentence, rooted in something mysterious, right? As Emerson is very much like Nietzsche, very much like a Proclus, who says that this poetic inspiration is the infinite. Right? That with our finite organs, that are words, they're all come from this infinite spirit, right? Like in this kind of beautiful mystery of the infinite or the abyss or the ever expansive landscape, right? That when that little bug or seed, as Emerson also likes to refer to it, gets into our soul, then even in death, because he even talks about the corpse has a seed in it, right? You can see that infinite and that mystery that is, yeah, just charming, also scary, but also the root of what all that poetry comes from. And when we write analytic papers, we're acting as if we can etherize the woman on the table. And so,
Yeah, you lose that. I always like to Keats's negative capability, which also another in the sort of American tradition Dewey took up of just like instead of that the sense of mystery is just like something we can never know. It's just being present with the world, and it's the infinite ability to generate. And that's also, I mean, this is why Vico agrees. Like poetic wisdom is being present with the mystery, not as a negative as positive. Interestingly, and people miss this, and especially Wittgenstein's later writings, like that's where he tries to get at this issue at the end of the Tractatus, which is there's no amount of propositions that are going to exhaust the world. So part of them, the task is like dealing with this presence that you wouldn't, strangely, even the most analytic of people even end up addressing. So yeah, that's just refreshing for me always to go back to Emerson for this. So it was fun to do this.
Oh, thank you guys. As always, Gareth, do you have a closing?
I will finish with one of my favorite Emerson quotes, which also happens to be in the First Nature essay. The problem of restoring to the world original and eternal beauty is solved by the redemption of the soul. The ruin or the blank that we see when we look at nature is in our own eye. The axis of vision is not coincident with the axis of things, and so they appear not transparent but opaque. The reason why the world lacks unity and lies broken and in heaps is because man is disunited with himself. He cannot be a naturalist until he satisfies all the demands of the spirit.
There's a call for this world moment continually. Though it was true then, it's certainly true now.
All right, thank you guys. See you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Oh dear.